In 1974, a farmer who was living on the outskirts of modern-day Xi'an in central China was digging a well, and as he looked down into the pit, he saw what he thought was a human head. Now, it wasn't an actual human head, but what he discovered that day led to one of the most significant archaeological projects of the modern age. And this was the mausoleum of the first emperor of China, an absolutely astonishing sight. So as always, I think it's really important for us to understand what was the world like in the 3rd century BCE when this huge complex was constructed. Well, to begin with, the young man who we are going to be talking about, whose name you see right down here at the bottom of the screen, was born in the period that was known as the period of the Warring States. And this was a time of great chaos, and adding to the chaos for him was the fact that when he was only 13 years old, his father, the king of the Qin kingdom, died, making him a 13-year-old ruler. He immediately ordered the beginning of construction of a palace for himself as a living ruler, as well as a palace for himself in the afterlife. And so over his career that is about 36 years long, we're going to have as many as 700,000 workers that are busy working on this vast palace complex that is intended to hold him in the afterlife, in his immortality. So let's talk about the career of this young man. Over the time, just after he has become king, he manages, after a period of some time, to establish firm control over the entire Qin kingdom. And from there, however, we see these other states that are part of the warring states. And so by means of military brutality, he's going to go out and conquer these until ultimately, when he has been in power for 25 years, he unifies all of these warring states. By this point, he is in his late 30s, and at this point, he declares himself Qin Shi Huang, or Qin Shi Huangdi, which means the first emperor of China. Over the time when he was ruling, he had to establish rule over this very, very diverse population. This is something that we've talked about with other emperors as well. And so one of the ways in which he was very, very successful at that was not only by means of brutality and incredibly strict laws, but on top of that, by establishing standardization. So, for example, he established a standardized system of writing so that everyone could communicate. He established a standardized currency and weights and measures. He even established a standardized axle width for wagons and extended the roads and the canals so that it would be easy to move throughout and communicate throughout the entire empire. And so he was very, very efficient with standardization and brutality. So over this entire period that he is expanding his empire, he goes beyond just the 7 warring states and moves even farther west and south. He expands the defensive walls that we today refer to as the Great Wall of China. Those are expanded to a tremendous amount during his reign. Let's talk about and let's take a look at this massive complex that was being constructed during the entire 3.5-decade period that he was in power. This site is most famous for the terracotta warriors, which we see in this huge pit right here, which has some of the approximate 6,000 to 8,000 life-size terracotta warriors. But it's not only warriors that are in this palace complex for the afterlife. He appears to have tried to create a sort of facsimile of the court that was existing in this world. And so in other pits, other sorts of court officials have been found. Court officials as well as people like musicians and dancers and acrobats. And so this whole thing was intended to be a place for him to live in the afterlife. Now, he was very, very concerned about immortality, much like the ancient Egyptian pharaohs who spent their rules preparing for the afterlife as well. But Qin Shi Huang was especially aware of the fact that he had made, over the course of his rule, many, many enemies. And perhaps it is for that reason that he orders the construction of these thousands of soldiers that are going to accompany him into the afterlife and presumably support and defend him in the afterlife. So let's talk about exactly what these soldiers look like and how they were constructed. So in this massive pit, what we have are rows and rows and rows of soldiers, and each one of these soldiers is intended to look like no other soldier. Great lengths are taken to make them look truly individual. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But I want to talk first about what is it exactly that we are looking at. So we see these rows of soldiers and horses. There would have been chariots as well, and then there are rammed earth walls that are between them. Now you can see that what would have been going across this would have been wooden beams, and then a wooden roof was placed on top of that. And then the plan was that when this whole thing was finished, then earth would have been placed on top of this. It would have been turned into a mound and would have just looked like a sort of hill in the landscape. And so this was the plan. This represents what is the largest project using ceramics of any time that we know in world history. And so the way that these workers created these ceramic figures is that there were all of these different molds. And what we have is essentially an assembly line. As they have molds of different kinds of ears, molds of different kinds of noses, different kinds of chins, all of these different body parts, different facial hair, and all of these different things. And so you've got all of these different individual parts. And then when it came time to assemble them, they would mix and match these individual parts, attempting to make each soldier look like no other soldier. Now, not only are they appearing then, some may have like a cleft chin, others will have a rounder chin. Even the shapes of the ears are very clearly different. Look at this one with a much larger earlobe than this one that is right next to him, for example. They are also distinguished one from another in the things that they wear. Their facial hair is different. Their hairstyles are different. And so it's really, really clear that an effort was made to make these look as absolutely individual as possible. Adding to that is the fact that originally they were all brightly painted. And you can see from this museum display illustration the different kinds of colors that would have been used and the different minerals that would have been made to make them brightly painted. And so by using paint, this would have enabled the workers to individualize these thousands and thousands of soldiers even more. Why was it so important to Qin Shi Huang that these 6,000 or 8,000 soldiers look so individual? Well, it reminds me of what we talked about when we were talking about the Inca, and we were talking about the rulers there, and we think about those huge walls that are found in Cusco, and the fact that there are all these different shapes and all of these different sizes, but they are put together such that they merge perfectly. And we talked about how that represents the ability of the Inca ruler to effectively and efficiently rule this incredibly diverse population. Because perhaps it's that same idea that Qin Shi Huang was concerned with here. He wanted to communicate that his soldiers came from every single part of the empire, and therefore that he has the ability, just like that Inca emperor, to command diversity. All right, so the figures are between 6 and 6.5 feet tall, and if we look at them carefully now in this first pit, they all are standing here. I want us to understand that while these are made of terracotta, this was actually a step forward in the way that these tombs were constructed. In ancient China, in earlier times, living people would have been sacrificed and placed in the tombs. But with this, we have moved from sacrificing living people to instead using terracotta models of these soldiers. These terracotta soldiers, you can tell by their hands that they would have been holding weapons, and so they were holding full-size functional bronze weapons. And so we have what look like perhaps spearmen here, but there were other kinds of soldiers as well. We see here a horse. Back here is the charioteer. The chariot itself would have been made of wood. I've got another shot right over here. Here is the indentation, the remains of one of these wooden wheels from a chariot. And so there are all kinds of other soldiers as well. This is the backside of an archer, and I was just astonished by the minute detail. Even on the bottom of the shoe of the archer, we can see some of the remaining paint on this one right here. So when we talk about this, what I want us to remember is that it is this huge diversity of the empire that is reflected in the individualization of these different soldiers. The actual tomb of the emperor himself is located about a mile away from these 4 pits where there is still ongoing archaeological work. However, the main mausoleum has been preserved, has not been excavated. It is being preserved for the future. And the reason for that is we can see that once these figures were exposed to the air, the paint that was originally on them immediately began to fade. And so we can't even tell by looking at groups of them like this that there was paint. And so we're reserving the main tomb until later when more advanced techniques for preservation have been established. When he was 49, Qin Shi Huang died, and his son came to the throne, but was nowhere near as respected or feared a ruler. And so immediately there were rebellions all over the empire. And within 4 years, the Han had come in and had managed to defeat the Qin. And in that conquest, they came across this mausoleum, and they walked in, and because it was still unfinished at this point, and here were these thousands of bronze weapons, and they stripped the soldiers of their weapons, and once they had taken everything that they could find, they set that wooden roof on fire. And so when the wooden roof collapsed, it fell down on top of all of these soldiers. And so what we see in the parts that have been left in their native state is this, I think, really, really poignant and powerful image, because even though these are terracotta sculptures of soldiers, their broken bodies speak of the dreadful costs of war, on real people, the chaos, the terror, the pain, and the violence on real human beings throughout all of history.